Okay, here we go. We're kind of right in the middle of what is known as American imperialism. Yesterday, if you were able to watch the intro video, or Monday, if you were able to watch the intro video, and yesterday's video lesson, then we are right in the midst of emerging as a world power. And that's kind of the overall title of this chapter. Whether it be for the extraction of vast quantities of natural resources that lay in what we would refer to as our Western Hemisphere domain, whether it be for competition amongst European nations for the title of superpower, or whether there be some racist sentiments, religious sentiments, mixed, intertwined. Regardless, America is expanding into a new frontier. And if we study civilizations over time, every civilization reaches a point where they continue to extend their borders. So we're repeating the history of many cultures and civilizations before America. This just so happens to be our turn. We also know that following the events of yesterday, as from a territorial perspective, we've added Hawaii to the United States, and we've picked up some possessions throughout not only the Caribbean but also the Pacific following the events of the Spanish-American War, such as the Philippines and Guam and Cuba and Puerto Rico. Now, what the United States is beginning to do following the aftermath of the Spanish-American War is we've kind of set up our stepping stones so that we can reach Asia and begin to open that door with the vast number of competing countries who are already in China. We want to develop our own sphere of influence and try to accumulate a market of Chinese not only natural resources but any materials or supplies or goods that could follow our new trade routes from the Philippines to Hawaii back to the United States. Kind of ended yesterday's lecture in what was known as the open door policy. And this open door policy really was a United States entry into the region of Asia and into those markets. So we've really kind of expanded our whole industrial type of mindset, our factory type of mindset, and of course our investments to beyond America's borders. And it's going to bring an enormous return, economic return to the United States. It's also going to develop these regions with some of our new technology, some of our new infrastructure, some of our culture. There's going to be an assimilation process. American goods are going to flow freely and throughout Latin America and then eventually into parts of Asia as well. So it really is a global or international peak of an American presence. Now, the downside, the viewpoint side that begins to generate some opposition is stemming from the aftermath of what happens in the Philippines. Specifically in the Philippines, after fighting side by side with Emilio Alganado and the Filipino leaders for their independence, the United States stays and ends up fighting against the Filipino people themselves. And that becomes known as the Filipino insurrection. And during that process, there was a lot of questions raised that what is the current status of citizens or people who live in Cuba or who live in the Philippines or who live in Puerto Rico? Are they American citizens? Do we hoist our American flag? Do they have the same constitutional rights? So, questions on the home front back inside the United States begin to rise of what is the current status of the possessions and the people groups who live there. And that in itself creates this wave of anti-imperialism. The losses and the casualties and the deaths, and not only during the Spanish-American War, but in the aftermath with the Philippine insurrection, just kind of makes America, or it labels America as an imperialist nation. And along with imperialist nation comes once again that title of a conquering nation. we got a league that kind of forms with opposition, starting with William Jennings Bryan and Jane Addams and Mark Twain, denouncing what America has become. In essence, America has become England. We are a mother country. We've turned into what we once despised and what we once fought against for freedom. Are we or are we not that champion of liberty? So we kind of entered that phase, and what we're going to see as we maneuver into this next section coming out of American imperialism is us kind of fortifying what we have accomplished, fortifying what we have done. And we do this with a new strong profile. And that new strong profile is going to come from the individual who was part of this whole process, the individual who took specifically the Sea Power Upon History, written by Alfred T. Mahan, and published or passed it out to the American Navy, and kind of really helped. He was there for the building up of this American Navy. His name is Theodore Roosevelt. And as he comes into the presidency following the assassination of William McKinley, he has a goal. And part of his goal is to continue the vision that was casted literally in this book of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. One of the elements that has yet to be completed was this idea of building a canal. If you remember, by the end of the lecture yesterday, what the United States had done is, specifically in Hawaii, we have built a naval base in what we will call Pearl Harbor, and with the Platt Amendment, we built a naval base specifically in Cuba, known as Guantanamo Bay. So what we have now is we have ships on both coastlines to protect on the west coast our national security out of the port of Pearl, or the naval base of Pearl Harbor, and on the east coast we got from the port or the naval base of Guantanamo Bay battleships to protect the east coast. So we fortified our national security. The question was, what if war breaks out on the west coast? How do we get our ships that are on the east coast to the west coast faster, and vice versa, for protection in our hemisphere? Well, of course, there had been a long-awaited construction plan to build a canal. And what we'll see Roosevelt do is he will further that cause and that idea, and in instance basically spark a revolution in Panama for the Panamanians to revolt against their Colombian leaders, so that we can then come in, help the Panamanians, and then build a canal. What Roosevelt believed in was an old African proverb called "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And his idea here with this big stick was to let the stick do the talking. The stick, metaphorically, is a display of America's might. The stick is also a display of America's battleships. One of the key elements of this big stick policy were 16 bright white painted battleships, hot off the steel press, ready to go. Coming off of the ocean with the sun beating down on them. What an intimidating force. This was called the Great White Fleet, and Roosevelt prided himself and he prided the country in parading this Great White Fleet throughout the Caribbean. That in itself would do the talking. That in itself would not only keep maybe competition or European powers at bay, but it also would remind those countries who is in charge of these waters, and who is in charge of the markets that are in their country. It really was a very blunt policy. And then, of course, we'll see as Roosevelt's term moves out, we're going to try to change that image and maybe not make it so forceful or make it so strong, but to kind of reshape some of the negative effects of American imperialism as we moved into Taft with dollar diplomacy, and eventually into Wilson with moral diplomacy, taking a different approach to what has already happened during this era of American imperialism. That's about the halfway point at this moment. From here, we will venture into the end of Wilson's administration with moral diplomacy, and then the guns of August will sound in Europe, and we'll find ourselves trying to remain neutral, but we will get pulled in to what is known as the Great War.